So for this mixing hack, we're going to talk a bit about Live's warping and its warp engine. And the reason I put this in the mixing hacks category is because I hear a lot of people often complain about Ableton Live's audio quality, its output audio quality. And I think a lot of that resentment comes from people who don't really understand how the warp engine works or how the warp could potentially be affecting their audio files for their stems or whatever it is in their mix. And so I want to address some of those concerns. Now, this video is presupposing here that you have some working knowledge of warping and what it is. We're not really going to talk all that much about that, but we will talk about the different warp modes and the effect that they have on the audio quality so that you can make the best choice for which warp mode to use if you need to use a warp mode on audio to maximize or optimize your audio quality. So let's take a listen to what we have here. I've got just a simple pad loop. And the pad loop was rendered at 120 BPM. That's what my project tempo's at, so we're just hearing it as it was recorded. Notice how warp is turned off on the clip down here. And this is going to sound as clean as possible. If I take an audio file and I drag and drop it into Live and warping is turned off, it's going to play back as recorded. It's going to sound as clean as possible. So one thing I'll preface all of this with is if you can get away with not warping an audio file, go ahead and leave warping off. It's going to give you the cleanest possible audio. Because as soon as we turn warp on, we start to do something destructive to the audio file. So with warp on, I have my default warp mode set to Beats mode. Now we can go ahead and change that if you want to in the preferences under the Record Warp Launch tab. You can see default warp mode set to Beats. You can use Beats, Tones, Texture, Repitch, or Complex, any one of those. I'm going to leave mine on Beats. And what Beats mode is going to do to the audio file is literally go through the audio file and slice it up. If you've ever used the slice to MIDI feature in Live, it's very similar to that. So the way it's doing that right now is because I've selected Beats mode and I'm using the preserve setting of transients, that means that everywhere we see one of these little gray transient markers, that's where a slice is getting created in the audio file. Now if we play it back at its normal BPM, 120, not really going to notice all that much of a difference. But if we take this and we start to slow the project tempo down, we're going to start to hear loops at the end of each slice. And you notice how the pad starts to sound a little bit garbled and kind of weird. And this is often what you're hearing if you, especially something like this, a pad sound that's very sustained. If you take something sustained like this and you warp it in Beats mode and you start to slow the tempo down, even just a little bit, you'll start to hear it. What's happening is at the end of each slice, so for example, we have a slice that goes from about here to about here. Let me zoom in a bit more. But you can see the transient marker here. I'll place a warp marker there so we can see it a little bit more easily. So from here to here, that's one slice. Now if we slow the tempo way down, it's going to play through this slice slower, but to fill in the gap between the beginning of this slice and the beginning of this slice right here, it takes the end of the sample and it starts looping it. And it's going to loop it back and forth, or we can tell it to loop forward, which is going to sound a little bit different. Now the other thing we can do here is tell it not to loop at all. Just play through each slice and stop. So now we can clearly hear there's a long gap between each one of those slices. And there's our last slice there. So just be aware that the Beats mode is going to chop up the audio file and it will either loop it based on one of these loop settings here, or it'll just play through and then stop and leave the gap if the audio file is playing back slower, in this case much slower than it was recorded at. It was recorded at 120. We can also, just a quick note here, you can change the preserve setting so that it does more of a rhythmic or an even slice. And this can be interesting, for example, let's go back to our default tempo 120. This could be interesting, for example, if I take this envelope setting, which is going to shorten the length that each slice plays back for. We have this 16th note preserve and we start to shorten this. We can start to create these interesting kind of gated effects, sort of abusing the warp mode to do something creative and rhythmic here. So just something to be aware of. I think that's a nifty little trick to play around with. So again, be aware that Beats mode is going to slice the audio up. Now Tones and Texture mode, both of these are going to do something similar. Let's start with Tones. Tones is also going to slice the audio up, but instead of in Beats mode where we have these nice even divisions of where it's slicing, or either it's slicing on the transient markers, Tones mode is going to slice it into grains, which are really small slices. So we're going to have hundreds, maybe even thousands of these slices or grains throughout the course of this audio file. And the grain size is letting us choose how big or small these slices are. So bigger grain size means a bigger slice, smaller grain size means smaller slices. Now again, if we play this back at 120, I'm not going to notice all that much difference. Let's just get rid of these warp markers. We won't need them anymore. But if we start to slow the tempo down again, you start to hear that granular stretching as each of those grains, there's now a gap between each of those grains. We can adjust the size of each grain. So we've got bigger chunks of audio playing one after another, but they're all spread apart because we've slowed the tempo down. Let's go back to where this was. I think it was at 35 or somewhere in there. And even if we left the tempo at 120, which is our original tempo, this will also start to take effect if you go down here to the segment BPM and we start to play around with the time stretching from here. You'll start to hear that granular effect with tones mode as we are slicing the audio into these grains. So let's reset our segment BPM back. Now texture mode, we'll jump to this one really quickly. This is going to do the exact same thing as tones mode, but it gives you this flux control which will randomize the grain slices. So let's slow the project tempo again, maybe 90 BPM or something. Let's turn up the grain size a bit, but now let's turn up flux. Let's really slow it down. Let's go back up to the tempo. So now we're getting these just completely random grain slices. Again, this can be an interesting sound design technique. We could take this and resample it and get this kind of stuttery, granular pad effect as opposed to the nice smooth pad that we came in with. Let's turn the grain size down a little bit, keep the flux up nice and high. Maybe whack the tempo up a little bit here. Just really stretch that sucker out. So again, this can be desirable if we're doing some crazy, sound effect, sound design type stuff, but just this is stuff to be aware of when you're warping audio in your tracks. If you don't really need to mess with it or slice it up in texture mode and randomize the slice size, you're going to optimize your audio quality. You're going to prevent any chopping from taking place. Now the next one down, which is repitch. This one is a good one, for example, on this loop here, which is 120 BPM. Let's reset the project tempo to 120. If I bring in a sample that's the same BPM as the project I'm working at, and for some reason I need to warp it, repitch can be a really good mode for that, because repitch isn't going to do any sort of destructive slicing. The downside of repitch, though, as you can see here, we can no longer transpose the audio file. We will be able to time stretch it, but if we time stretch it, if we adjust the tempo, it's going to change pitch. But this could be a good one to use if you need to warp an audio file, but you're playing it back at the same tempo as your project. If you need to warp it, repitch can be a good one because we're not chopping up the audio, we're not doing anything really destructive to it. But just be aware if down the line, if you decide to change the tempo of your track, you're changing the pitch of any audio that's warped in repitch mode, and it could potentially throw off the key of the track. So just be careful with that one. Then we have complex mode. Now complex mode is great because it gives us the freedom to transpose without changing the length of the sample, or vice versa. It gives us the ability to change the length of the sample without transposing it. And it doesn't do any sort of slicing, but there are some downsides to complex mode. I've noticed with complex mode, if you got something with a lot of high frequencies, hi-hats, shakers, white noise, for example, complex, for some reason, based on the time stretch algorithm it uses, it kind of dulls, or it's almost like you're putting an EQ and shelving down some of the higher frequencies. So you lose a little bit of the quality of the higher frequencies, and if we start to slow the tempo down, we start to again get these sort of garbly artifacts in the audio file. You can hear a little bit of the clarity. You hear this kind of metallic artifact showing up in the sound as we slow it down. I mean, generally speaking, complex is a pretty good one, but do be aware that it will dull some of the high frequencies, and if we start to slow things down, it's going to still give us a little bit of artifacty graininess that we might not want in the sound. And then lastly, we have Complex Pro, which is going to operate in the exact same way as complex. We're applying a time stretch algorithm here. We're not doing any slices, but this one is really sort of optimized for vocals. So for something like this, I probably wouldn't use Complex Pro. Now you notice with Complex Pro we have this formants control, and what that's going to do is it's going to do its best to preserve vowel sounds. That's what formants are when we start to drastically time stretch audio. So if you got a lot of A's, E's, I's, O's, U's, and sometimes Y's, if you remember from grade school, the vowels, if you have a lot of those in a spoken or sung vocal phrase, you may want to try warping it in Complex Pro. Again, if you need to warp it. If you don't need to warp it, just leave warp off. But Complex Pro does a pretty decent job maintaining those vowel sounds with the formants control here. And you can kind of set a level for how clear or how much of the vowel clarity you want to come through. And just bear in mind it's not going to maintain them 100%, but it'll get it as close as it can based on how you're time stretching the audio file. But like I said earlier, if you can get away with not warping, turn warp off. In fact, you might even want to go so far as to go here to your record warp launch preferences and maybe even take the setting here that says loop warp short samples, maybe even set it to unwarped one shot. And that way, whenever you bring an audio file in, it's not just going to automatically warp it for you. You may want to also turn off auto warp long samples. I have this off on my settings here. This is great, for example, if you're bringing in stems. Let's say you're doing a mix down, you just bounce down all the stems for your track. If we bring in all those stems and we leave this on, Live is going to automatically warp them to whatever our default warp setting is. And if we're not paying attention to that or we overlook that, we're going to get all these artifacts showing up in the sound that we don't need to have there. So I like to always have this off. For the short samples preference, choose whatever you want, but you may want to try this out because it won't warp anything for you automatically. It will only warp audio if you manually go down here and turn warp on, set a warp setting, etc. So like I said, if you can avoid warping, turn it off altogether, but if you absolutely need to do it, and let's be honest, there are cases when we absolutely need to warp stuff, hopefully given what you've just learned about these different warp settings, you'll choose the best option to optimize your audio and get the least amount of artifacting or the least amount of destruction to your audio file. If you're not quite sure what the best option is for a certain type of audio, just try all of them and see which one sounds the best. Complex Pro isn't always going to sound the best, so just be aware of that. I see a lot of producers kind of default to that one, and it's pretty good, but it's not always going to be the best. So try all of them and see which one is going to sound best for you. And I hope you've taken away some helpful information from this. Explore the different warp modes and see what sounds best on the audio files that you are using in your mixdowns. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.